So let's introduce them. First of all, to my immediate right, Geoffrey Renard Allen. He's written 2 collections of poetry, 3 works of fiction, including The Song of the Shank. And this is a story which is of fascination to anyone who has an interest in American history, which I presume is all of the people sitting in this tent. It tells the story of Blind Tom, a slave, a savant, a musical genius, set in post-Civil War America. So I think I'm going to be very interested to hear from Geoffrey about how the arc of history in the US has bent 150 years on. Please make him welcome. Angela Flournoy's debut novel, The Turner House, is doing extremely well at the moment. It's set in Detroit in 2008. Now, you don't need me to tell you that that's a very interesting place and a very interesting time, the year that Barack Obama was elected to his first term to the White House, and just before the Great Recession hit, which hit Detroit probably harder than any other city in the United States, and again just feeds right into what we want to talk about today. In fact, the Turner House was shortlisted for the National Book Award. It will launch what will no doubt be a brilliant writing career. Please make her welcome, Angela Flournoy. PJ O'Rourke. Well, if you need me to introduce him, I think you're in the wrong tent. Rolling Stone, National Lampoon, it goes on and on. Some books, the titles of which are probably not fit to mention in polite company. It's a great pleasure for me to be sitting on the same stage with him. PJ O'Rourke, ladies and gentlemen. And right at the end, the dashing Bill Finnegan. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker and has written some really powerful pieces of journalism on some of the touchstones of the debate in the United States right now. Immigration, poverty. The thing is, he was writing about them in some cases a couple of decades ago, so it'll be very interesting for him to hear from him today about what's changed or what hasn't, and once again, how we have found ourselves at this remarkable point in history in the United States. But his novel, Barbarian Days, is the one that he's here to talk about at this festival. It's fantastic. It's a memoir of a surfing life. I'm a Mallee boy, and for the first time reading it, I kind of understood the passion. I kind of understood what's going on. It made me want to go out and buy a surfboard. My wife stopped me, but it may yet happen. Please make him welcome, and please thank all our panellists. So look, I really don't know where this conversation is going to go today. It's going to be an adventure. I think I'll let our panellists, take it where it wants to go. We could spend an hour talking about Donald Trump. We're not going to do that, or at least I hope we're not going to do that, but we are going to spend some of it. And I think that's probably where we will start off. It's been another incredible, crazy, remarkable week in this American election campaign. Some things have been said that have been challenged. Some things have been said that haven't been challenged. And that has, I think, set a new tone for civil discourse in the US, and I wonder what the effects will be, once this election is over, whichever way it goes. But I think it's probably a good place to start. How did we get here? PJ, would you like to take us off?
Good Lord. I have just been assuming, for me, this has been a disaster because I am a political humorist, and I can't be funnier than this election. I'm a political satirist, and this election has been utterly self-satirizing, And I'm a political commentator, and I haven't been able to get a word in edgewise with Trump. So not only, I am outraged by this, of course, but not only am I outraged, I'm out of work. So I just, I really don't know. I had early on, relatively early on, during the February New Hampshire primary, the first major primary in the United States, I had an assignment from BBC Radio for their overseas service to do a piece on the New Hampshire primary. Now here's a thing to tackle. You have 27 minutes to explain American politics. And not only that, but you're explaining it to foreigners. And not only that, but because it's the overseas service, many of those foreigners, English is not their first language. So, here was a puzzle problem, and I failed to solve it. But I I did go around and interview a lot of Trump supporters because I figured this is the thing that is mystifying people overseas is a Trump support. And what I came away with was not, I didn't dislike the people who were supporting Trump. In fact, I live in New Hampshire, and many of these people were familiar, many of them were neighbors. There was a profound frustration with government, not necessarily starting at the top down. There was a lot of, you'd say, wait a minute, okay, so you're voting for Trump. Why are you voting for Trump? And they would start explaining, well, I own a gas station, and I can't get the state, federal, and local permits to take out the old gas tanks that are leaking, and I can't get the state, federal, and local permits to put in a new gas tank. And what am I supposed to do? Stand around with the gas in my cupped hands? And I go, well, point taken, but electing a maniac as president of the United States, how exactly does that fix this? But it is a real middle, I see it as basically being a middle finger vote. And I mean, it is a vote, it is just, you know, and the more you make fun of Donald Trump, the more one makes fun of Donald Trump, the more the people who are voting for him are saying, yes, you're exactly right. He's a vulgar loudmouth, he's an idiot, and that's just what you deserve in Washington. We're giving you what you deserve in Washington. Which, of course, I needn't say how terribly dangerous that sort of thinking is. But one tiny last thing before I pass this on to somebody else is that it is always to be remembered, and one thing that shows just how the elite is how disconnected we are from the American public. I've never seen The Apprentice. I don't know anybody who watches The Apprentice. I may know some people who have tuned in once for a moment, but I mean, you know, why would one watch? Well, 200 million Americans, this guy has been in their home every week for years. They think they know him. You know, I mean, they are voting for a character on a television show. And it is my hope that now, in full exposure, that they're seeing who the person is that is playing this character. So it's like actually meeting, who did we decide on? Was it Robert Downey Jr. or no, you had a better. Charlie Sheen, yes. I mean, all well and good up on the screen and so on, you know, but in person, no thank you. You know, Mel Gibson, you know, would be, you know, to give an Australian example. So I'm hoping that the actor behind the television character is coming to the fore.
Thanks, PJ. On behalf of Australia, I think we stopped calling Mel Gibson Australian quite some time back.
And you cannot be blamed for that.
No. Look, it's interesting what you say about reality television. I mean, maybe Donald Trump will be voted off the island. Maybe it's got people into their habit of voting. But so I think I started off by asking the question, how did we get here? Probably we should have taken it a step back and say, where are we? I mean, from this side of the Pacific, it really looks like we are watching a nation that has no idea who it is, fighting with itself, arguing over who should take the steering wheel, but not really sure where it's going anyway. And these fault lines that are opening right up. So I think I'd like to, perhaps Jeffrey, what is going on? Where are we? What is happening in the United States? Is this like anything you've ever seen before?
In many ways, it's very familiar, I think. What I mean to say by that is I feel that America has a certain kind of dishonesty about its own history, its own past, that it's never reckoned with. So, for example, you know, if you think about, let's say, the civil rights movement of 50 and 60 years ago, and you know what the Republican Party is today as a result of that. So when the South began to become desegregated, you know, people fled from the Democratic Party in the South and became Republicans and so on. And I think this sort of basic dishonesty about the origins of our nation is something that's never really been addressed. You know, this is a country that was founded on essentially the extermination of indigenous peoples. This is a country that has a foundation of slavery. And in slavery, when slavery was abolished in the years after slavery, I mean, literally thousands of African Americans were murdered in the South, and the U.S. government really did nothing about that. And, segregation was allowed to continue for 100 years after that, and essentially the government did nothing about that. I mean, it really took right-thinking people to force the government to make the right more decisions, things that are guaranteed to all American citizens by the Constitution. So I think this is one of the fundamental problems, and Donald Trump is tapping into a kind of reactionary resistance, which is...
Well, it's interesting. Donald Trump is making a pitch that he'll take America back to, the good times, the good old days.
Yeah, what are those good old days?
Yeah,
exactly. When is that, right?
Well, the good old days when, exactly, when the racial lines were defined and when there was a manufacturing industry. Angela, it's interesting. You set your novel in 2008 in Detroit, the year that Barack Obama was first elected to the White House. And because so much of what is going on in the United States at the moment is connected to race, the Black Lives Matter movement is the most obvious example, but it goes more deeply than that. I wanted to ask you, Barack Obama's often been criticised for not weighing in as much as he could. Probably when the killing of Trayvon Martin was the moment that you first saw him open up as an African-American man about what was going on. But he's been very careful to, I think, be the president for all Americans, whatever that means. Can you comment on that?
I don't know. I think that it's interesting to say that he has not sort of weighed in as much as he could. He's certainly weighed in more than any president in history has on a lot of these issues. I think that it is very sort of idealistic to think that a president can sort of reverse institutionalized racism through rhetoric. I think that he could perhaps try to do that through encouraging legislation, but we see what happens when he tries to encourage legislation in the current Congress. I don't think that, me personally, I've never, part of the reason that I set my book is in May of 2008 is because I wanted to talk about sort of the beginnings of the housing, the mortgage crisis, but I did not necessarily want the book to become one that was focusing on the sort of rise of Barack Obama in this sort of as a symbol and this idealism, because I have very sort of mixed emotions about that, because what happens now when you try to have a conversation about race with certain people in this country is that they immediately say, like, racism isn't an issue because, like, the most powerful man in the country is black, and that's not the way that racism works. So, sort of similarly, because that's not the way that racism works, and that's not the way that institutionalized racism works, like, that I don't have that much that I necessarily expect from Barack Obama as an individual. I think that certainly for a lot of people, my mother is in the audience somewhere, you can't negate him as a symbol and what he has represented, saying that Trayvon Martin could have been his son if he had a son, and openly weeping after the massacre in Charleston is something that those are moments that wouldn't have happened if he was not the president, not in that way. But at a certain point, one has to acknowledge that the institution of racism and the way that it plays itself, especially with our local militarized police forces, those are things that are bigger than what he could or not say in a speech.
Bill Finnegan, I want to come to you because the story that you wrote in the late 1990s about poverty in the United States. I mean, one of the things that we hear so often about the rise of Donald Trump and this growth of white nationalism is about the anger of the working class of America, or even the middle class of America, with the decline of manufacturing and as we talk about, where are the good old days? Where is the America that I used to know when I could have a job that would pay me $60,000, $70,000 a year? That was a long time ago, and yet these are the things that are sort of being blamed for the rise of this white nationalism at the moment. What's your reflection on that?
Yeah, I think the piece you're referring to was a long reported piece about a place outside Los Angeles that was sort of predictive in a way that I haven't really thought through, but downturn in local manufacturing, the aerospace industry in Southern California, causing an outer suburb to kind of implode. People who willing to live out that far, not pay too much for a house, suddenly their houses were worth nothing. The sort of big collapse we saw in 2008 happened earlier in Los Angeles and around Los Angeles, the housing prices. And so you had a lot of sort of white downward mobility in this place, people losing good jobs in aerospace, and lots of black and Latino families moving out from the city to, sort of like to a dream house in the suburbs, again, trading the long commute. So you had black and Latino upward mobility in this community, and it became so explosive, the sort of white rage about their situation. That's sort of why I went there, as I began to. I grew up near there and began to pick up on something that was going on in this big place called the Antelope Valley, and there was lots of neo-Nazism among the kids, and then some of the adults as well. This sort of white nationalist stuff that's always been in the U.S., but it was really catching fire, and reactions to that. I mean, anti-racist skinheads battling racist skinheads. It was just quite a little microcosm of social trouble in the U.S. And it did predict what we're seeing now. That is, I think that while I agree with PJ that Trump as a sort of comic figure, this actor turned, threat to the future of civilization. I mean, this real buffoonish actor too. I also was not someone who watched The Apprentice, but I got the idea. That while he is this kind of what we used to call an epiphenomena, this thing on top that's happening and has now become very serious, there's a much deeper movement that we've been seeing. People very unhappy with having Obama, whites very unhappy with having Obama as president, getting unhappier and unhappier as their own prospects have sort of stalled. But that was going on before, and just the Republican strategy, the sort of dog whistle racist campaign strategy, getting whites in the South to, for instance, move over completely into the Republican column. Used to be Democrats, and civil rights changed that. A lot of these movements are not, shockingly new things. I mean, the Republican Party's been going in this direction, and the elites of the party have been, with the rise of the Tea Party, it became obvious. But it was obvious before that there were currents underneath that weren't really under anybody's control. And it's true that you can see the roots of Trumpism. I mean, you can look back in American history and see plenty of demagogues that have caught parts of, sort of white working class rage. Figures like Father Coughlin in the 30s and Huey Long in Louisiana, and from the left as well at times. But the Trump thing has flowered in a way that I find terrifying. I mean, is at a different level, and I mean, I was heartened today to see that some of the sort of betting margin includes the possibility, I mean, in other words, people just who put money on these things, that he may drop out of this campaign. And that just, I think he has an excellent chance of winning, and the possibility that he might drop out is like, manna from heaven. Can that really?
That's interesting. I mean, we were having a discussion before. I think I've now come across at last to the moment where I think that he's probably done. But then again, we've all been so wrong so many times on this before. I'm interested because, again, those of us over here for so long have looked to the United States as this remarkable, incredible experiment in democracy that succeeded. Of course, what happened to the United States in the 20th century, becoming... And at the end of the 20th century, standing as the lone superpower, but holding on to these values that the country was built on. And to look at what's happening at the moment, we are perplexed, and we're not a little concerned because, of course, you are our major ally. So I'll just throw it open. I mean, as Americans, as people who live inside that country, as you watch what's going on, what is it like to watch what is happening in your country?
I think I'll say America's a big place. And so I'm from Southern California, like Bill. I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, which is one of the most ethnically diverse places in the United States. So I guess to be a little bit less gloom and doom, while sort of nationally there's trends in most major cities towards resegregation. Schools are more segregated than they were even like 40 years ago. There are also pockets of the United States where there is sort of the browning of America happening in the way that is talked about, say, on Fox News as this terrible thing, but it's happening organically, and it has not been pandemonium, and white people have not been like, you know, they haven't lost all of their jobs and their livelihood. I think one of the biggest things that sort of is behind perhaps this sort of middle finger vote you talk about, PJ, is this narrative of scarcity, that there is like simply not enough of jobs, of things, of whatever it is that makes you feel that you are comfortably middle class. And that narrative is not actually in line with statistics, especially in the past sort of 8 years. Things were more scarce as far as like jobs and credit lines, all sorts of things 8 years ago than they are right now.
PJ?
Well, first, I wouldn't be too, you know, I object to the term Trumpism because it gives a coherence to the Trump phenomenon that I don't think
Trumpian as
Trumpian, yeah, Trump-esque, you know, yes. Yeah, I would prefer, because it isn't an ism, because there is no, I mean, this is one of the worst demagogues you've ever seen in your entire life. I mean, what are demagogues famous for? Being able to give these powerful speeches that sway often the very most base and vile emotions in their audience. And this man can't put two coherent sentences together, you know? I mean, the thing that frightens me about Trump as a demagogue is that America seems to be hungry for a demagogue, and what if a good one comes along, you know? Then we'll really be in trouble, you know? I mean, this man's like too scattered to... I would tie the Trump support to something that's going on all around the globe, not just in the United States. I mean, let us be, you know, all countries have original sin. All countries are based in blood and conquest, horror and oppression. Something that unites Australia and the United States is it happened so recently we can still smell it. You know, in fact, it's still here. You know, but every country was founded on crime. It's the dark side of human nature. But there's a worldwide rebellion revolt against the elites going on. The elites are perceived to have failed the general populace. And it's not a wildly, it's not wrong perception. I mean, Putin is a sort of Russian populism, and certainly the Russian elites in the fall, after the fall of the Soviet Union, miserably failed the Russian people. European Brexit is a manifestation of revolt against the elites. You know, the European Union overreached itself in many ways. It has failed to deal with the refugee crisis, and of course, miserably failed to deal with the root causes of the immigration crisis. All around the world, even the sort of neo-Maoism that we're seeing in China has a populist element to it, where people are repelled by the deep corruption of the high Chinese officials, and so the higher Chinese officials are taking advantage of this to oppress everyone, you know, in the name of rooting out this corruption. But it was expressed to me most vividly, I think, and again, when I was interviewing Trump supporters. I'm talking to this sort of ordinary person, and this ordinary person said, look, this has been tough. It's a tough economy. I'm working hard. I pay my taxes. I do my job. I've got this problem. I've got that problem. I've got the other problem. And I turn on the TV news, and what are the political big shots talking about? They're talking about transgender bathrooms. He said, I run a timber company. We work in the woods. We don't have any bathrooms. So there is this kind of root frustration with the elite. And of course, the problem here is that by virtue of the fact that we read for pleasure, every person in this room is a member of the elite. And so, this is not to excuse what is going on, but merely to try and explain it and try to explain it to myself as best as I can.
It's one of the reassuring things that you often hear is that Donald Trump was elected on a primary vote of, I think, 40 million. In a country of more than 300 million, it's not many. But obviously the impact and on the social discourse has been massive. Jeffrey, do you feel as though it's overstated? I mean, if you're living in the United States and he's everywhere, and because that's exactly what he's good at, and that's why he got so many votes in the primaries, because he simply can control the news cycle, he can control the media. But if his support is actually that small, how do you feel about the influence he's having on the country and where he's taken that public discourse?
Yeah, I think it's really dangerous to assume that his support is small. I've been hearing that. That's a narrative you hear a lot in the media. And the statistics sort of speak against that. So, for example, there was a recent study done a few weeks ago, and among other things, they found that like 20% of the people surveyed believed that slavery shouldn't have been abolished, right?
I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, it's there. So let's say if you say let's say it was just 20% of Trump supporters, that still works out. So Trump got about 14 million votes. That's still 3 million people or something, right? Or if you say it's 20% of the American population, then that's what is that? 6 million people or something like that, whatever it is. But the point being, it's still a scary number when you think about that there are a large percentage of the voting populace who believe something of this sort. So I guess one of the things that's troubling to me often is that there is a certain kind of anti-intellectualism in America where people like Trump can really appeal, find popular appeal among people who Trump can really do nothing for. I mean, Trump is one of the elite, and I lived for many years in New York, and once you leave New York City and you go up into some of the towns upstate, I mean, there's basically nothing there. There are no jobs. And this is true like around the country, really. I mean, and that's part of this mythology that there was this great time where everyone had a fantastic job, and those times haven't existed for many years, So there's long been poverty in America, and there's also long been a need for greater education. So it's fairly true that most of Trump supporters have had no access to college and so on, and these are ongoing problems in our country in terms of education and things of this sort.
The title of this session is The State of the United States, and I wouldn't mind perhaps taking a look at some of the nuts and bolts of it. I mean, I think we forget from time to time that the United States has a completely unique electoral system. I mean, those of us who operate under the Westminster system, obviously we're very familiar with it, but there are some real idiosyncrasies of the American system, which, when you think about it, it's remarkable that it has worked as well as it has for as long as it has. The checks and balances that the so-called founding fathers put in place have worked well. But in the presidency of Barack Obama, I just wonder if the system is starting to show its age. When you have a Congress which explicitly said, we are going to do everything we can to simply obstruct and obfuscate the agenda of this president, and when you have a Supreme Court where the only reason some Republicans can bring themselves to support Donald Trump is because they might get him to nominate some Supreme Court justices that they agree with. That's the thing that gets them off to sleep at night. I just wonder if that political system, Bill, you think might be creaking.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of explanations for the sort of hyper-partisanship that has paralyzed Congress, for instance, the last 6 years. But it does arise from some disconnect between the parties and the voting population that's been increasing as a sort of professionalization of politics and the takeover of parties by lobbyists and that revolving door. That's all become much more intense in recent times, leading to this kind of mass alienation we've been talking about. I mean, the nuts and bolts, I'm not sure if you mean the electoral nuts and bolts, but that the American elections, people may already know this, have come down, presidential elections, to this crazy battle for a few what are called swing states. There's Florida and Ohio and Pennsylvania, a few states end up, I mean, there are solid Republican states and solid Democratic states, and they're sort of not in play. And the way the system works, each state, all its electoral votes, there are a couple of small exceptions, anyway, go toward whoever wins that state. So you can win the popular vote, as Al Gore did, for instance, in 2000, win it clearly, but not win the election, because you've won by 5 million in California, you've won by 3 million in New York, and it adds up, and you've won the most, but you've lost more states, and the arithmetic works out that you end up not winning the election. And so the states that could go either way, that have a mixed, an even balance of Republicans and Democrats, end up being the battlegrounds, and it's really small. I mean, this year everybody's saying it's 3 states, the 3 I mentioned, Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. There are a couple of others too. So it's really, I mean, talk about a creaky system. What are we doing? The sort of fate of the nation turning on
a suburb of Cincinnati.
Yeah, and on crazy Florida. This is not the first time lately, and yet the sort of structural reforms that might rectify some of this are sort of out of the question in a paralyzed legislature as we've had. I mean these are.
So I would disagree. I would disagree with that. I actually think America's electoral system is not so bad. It was created because we started out as 13 little bitty countries trying to get together, sort of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and then some, and 10 more. There was an attempt in our election of our chief executive to balance regional concerns with mere majorities. There were new states about to arrive. There were unpopulated but extremely economically important states. There's supposed to be a regionalist balance, and was the creation of the Electoral College. It gets a little awkward at times, but I think if we're looking for the core of what's wrong with the American political system and what the danger that this election presents is that we have a system of checks and balances, but compared to a parliamentary system like Australia's, it's a rather clumsy system of checks and balances with these 3 branches of government. And one of these 3 branches of government, the executive branch of government, has accrued to itself more and more power over the years, starting in the middle of the 19th century with the American Civil War. Ironically, the excessive power that the executive branch has, a very bad idea, comes from our best president, Abraham Lincoln, and it has proceeded since then. The other thing that's changed enormously since the Founding Fathers set up this system was that the executive branch was put in charge of foreign affairs where there weren't expected to be many. It would just, every 15 years or so, we had to decide whether to invade Canada or not. This, that, and the other thing. And so, I mean, globalization, the globe had not been invented really at the time that the executive powers. And so the true danger of Trump, and it makes someone like me who's a libertarian Republican and quite conservative in many of my political views, the reason that I will be voting for Hillary Clinton, even though I disagree with her about everything, Everything. I absolutely disagree with her. I consider Hillary Clinton to be wrong about absolutely everything, but I consider her to be wrong within the normal parameters of wrong. It's a wrong I'm familiar with. It's a wrong I have, I can allow for. It's a wrong I'm prepared for. It's a wrong we'll get over. With Donald Trump, I don't know what the hell is going to happen. And the problem is, he might turn out to be a bumbling fool, relatively harmless, who knows, but I think that's wishful thinking. You cannot put the kind of power that the executive in the United States, that the President of the United States has. He knows where that button is. I imagine he'll try and keep that knowledge from Trump if he becomes president, but it's like a toddler in a house with a loaded handgun. Sooner or later, he's going to find the thing. It's just, you cannot give the kind of power over foreign affairs, the kind of power over military intervention, and indeed the kind of power over trade policy that the President of the United States has to a damn fool like this, and then sit back and wait to find out whether he's just a damn fool or a really, really dangerous damn fool.
So the political system in America, I don't know if it's a function of the system or the structure, but it's taken this long for the country to have its first African-American president and potentially its first female president. Angela, do you think that it's robust enough to deal with a Donald Trump, who, in case you missed it, a couple of days ago, Joe Scarborough said that he had asked a security advisor 3 times, well, if we have nukes, why can't we use them?
Right. Yes. Yes, why indeed?
So here's the thing. I remember that there was a point 8 years ago when there was John McCain was rallying somewhere, and a man got the mic and was insisting, your opponent is a Muslim. He's a Muslim, isn't he? And John McCain just looked like sort of horrified. We want you all to think this, and we're speaking in dog whistles to you, so you don't vote for Barack Obama, but don't say it to my face because this is awkward, right? So I sort of feel, and then I felt like, oh, this will be terrifying if he's actually elected. And we were all sort of waiting with bated breath and terrified that perhaps him and Sarah Palin would actually be elected. Maybe not everybody, but I was. And Barack Obama won by a lot. And so part of me, I'm still terrified of Trump, does still hold out hope that that will be what happens if we are all just terrified enough. Maybe that's me, just I don't have I guess maybe I'm part of the elite. I live in Brooklyn. There's a lot of coffee shops around me, so maybe I don't
You're
have
part of the elite.
I'm part of the elite, and so I don't have a pulse on this sort of angry undercurrent of kind of white nationalism that is out there. Obviously, they're not going to say it to my face, but I am still confident that it's just too ridiculous to happen. But it would not have been, won't be the first time. I also thought that George W. Bush was elected. It was just too ridiculous to happen.
Don't we have such fond memories of that now?
Right, but he got passed by a hair, so there's, it could happen again.
Look, I think one of the things that is probably most concerning to me is that, having watched the development, if you like, of the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the things that drove that movement, as horrifying as they were, and that's still going on. And now you're seeing, the assassination of police officers. Okay, so that's pretty worrying. But that you have an election or a debate that on one side you have the rise of white nationalism, and on the other side you have what essentially is a modern black empowerment movement. That's a dynamic that I just wonder if you think that's got potential for problems. Jeffrey?
Well, I think, as you call it, the black empowerment movement is, for the most part, peaceful. I mean, there are obviously some extremists who believe in using violence.
You could say the same thing about the white nationalist movement.
Well, yeah, I agree, but I agree with that certainly. But I think one is a fundamental problem of attitude, and which is to say, the Black Lives Matter movement is hopefully pushing for legislation that can address some of these issues of police misconduct and abuse. But I mean, that was a familiar thing to me growing up in Chicago. I mean, we all knew about police who killed black people. We had a police station in Chicago where people were tortured, and quite famously, and one of the police superintendents was actually prosecuted back in the 80s because he allowed this to happen and things of this sort. So I don't see a conflict between these two groups, a dynamic of conflict there. I think, again, the Black Lives Matter movement, for the most part, is trying to bring about peaceful legislation, whereas I think what Trump represents is something completely different from that.
I completely agree. I think one of the things that struck me once you actually got out of DC and started travelling around was the level, the fact that people still had a problem with a black man being in the White House. And,
Right.
you know, I went and did a story on NASCAR, and I came back really quite stunned at some of the graffiti that you saw and some of the comments that you overheard. That is still a big problem for a lot of people. So, no, look, you're absolutely right, and not suggesting there are going to be, LA riots all over again. But, I mean, Bill, it's a delicate discussion for a country to have, particularly at a time when you have someone like Donald Trump out there beating the bush on it.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to overstate the sort of depth of sort of white identity politics that are driving this Trump campaign. I mean, I know there are plenty of perfectly nice people who support Trump, but the depth of his appeal, I mean, the basic, "Make America Great Again," is very much an appeal to sort of I want to say white supremacy, sense of white security and sort of majority rule, and that's what's being threatened, and that's what's underneath so much of what we hear.
Oh gosh, I just don't think that's true. I just don't think that's true.
It might not be true in New Hampshire.
I think well, of course it's not true in New Hampshire, where we have absolutely zero diversity, and most of the prejudice is aimed at French Canadians. And to a certain extent the Irish, I may say. There is no doubt that white supremacist types are likely to support Donald Trump, but it's tying it up in much too neat a package to simply link these things. It is turning for us, remember, we're all members of the elite, and what we have just done is turned all members of all Trump-esque supporters into the enemy, into the alien, into people with opinions so disgusting that we can't understand. I think it's much better to think of this in terms of a rebellion against the elite, because Black Lives Matter is a rebellion against the elites also. It is the Trump supporters are not alone in this. This manifests itself in many different ways. And the frustration that is out there is a wholesale frustration with the way the economy is going is very, if you had to pick a single central point, it would be the very slow recovery from our 2008 recession. And then the elites are out there doing things that ordinary people simply can't understand, like negative interest rates. Negative interest rates. You're asking me, you're begging me, you're telling me to save up for my old age, and then you charge me for it. What the hell kind of sense does that make? You see, the level of frustration, yes, racism plays a part in this, and yes, prejudice plays a part in this. There's absolutely no denying that. And are these things deeply ingrained in America? Yes, they are, and they must be rooted out. But that's not all that's going on. And if we, the elites, can't relate at all to the frustration of the people who feel themselves to be outside the elites, we are not going to be able to reason with them. We are not neither Republicans nor Democrats. I mean, the people on this panel, well, me anyway, probably disagree radically with the other people on this panel but we agree, we are in perfect agreement that an extremely dangerous fool like Donald Trump cannot be given the levers and the pulleys of power. But we have to figure out a way to explain ourselves. We can't just go out there and say it's because he's bad. He's a racist pig. He may well be, but I mean, that's not sufficient. We have to address the frustration that people are feeling.
I don't think that you can divorce the sort of the white supremacist racist undertones of Trump supporters from anger at the elites. I don't think that those things are separate. I think that they're very much married. And also.
But it's not a 100% Venn diagram overlap by any means.
Well, of course.
You also can't equate. I mean, I agree with the broad point about needing to understand what this movement is as opposed to demonizing it and sort of failing to understand it. But you can't put together, under the heading of anti-elitism, Black Lives Matter protesting police misconduct in black communities. That's one thing, which is like vehemently sort of ridiculed and abused in Trump support circles.
Yes.
And the anti-elitism of Trump forces, which focuses completely differently on a completely different elite,
I think you
not
can.
cops.
I think you can. I mean, who, if you're poor and you're living in a slum, who is the elite that you see every day? Cops.
It certainly isn't the undocumented immigrants that he wants to build a wall around, though.
No, I mean, that's outright xenophobia. I mean, there's a huge element of all sorts of bad human. But see, one of the things that makes me a conservative is that I don't believe that deep down inside people are good. I don't have Rousseau's faith, that if people were simply allowed to do what they wanted, they would all be good, No, damn it, I'm a Christian. I believe in original sin, I believe people are bad, And I believe that it is the responsibility of educated, and involved people to convince people not to be bad. We live in democracy, so we can't force them not to be bad. We have to convince them not to be bad. And if we even verge on name calling, we actually make them stronger. I mean, what would if you tell Trump supporters as a whole, you are all a bunch of racists, that their reaction to that is, yeah, and I'm going to vote for Trump twice.
Yeah.
Which is a nice segue. We've got 10 minutes left, and I do want to wrap up with probably the biggest question on my mind. Look, I think we all know what the answer is if Donald Trump wins the presidency. It's the end of civilization. But let's be optimistic and assume that the better angels in the United States, as Joe Biden called them, will prevail, and that he will be repudiated and, in my view, hopefully humiliated and never heard from again. But what happens after that? I mean, the box has been opened, the bottle has been uncorked. Where does this leave the United States, public discourse, the social fabric, once it's all over? Jeffrey?
Well, I think there will be many more Donald Trumps, and I guess I believe humans are not born good either, by the way. So maybe that makes me a conservative. So, no, I mean, I feel that there's a kind of authoritarian strain in American culture that Donald Trump represents. And I also feel it's kind of a misconception to see racism as this kind of very closely defined thing. I mean, it's a kind of gradation, I mean, people can someone can sit down and have a cup of coffee with me and also be a racist as well. I mean, there's a lot of complexities of race and all of those kinds of things in America. And I think that's part of one of the, what I was saying before about sort of the failure of Americans to recognize the history and to have honest conversations about the history, which is this failure to recognize your own mistakes sometimes. So,
Angela.
Well, I'm voting for Hillary Clinton, although I also do not agree with a lot.
That's interesting. I mean, any other election, any other Republican candidate, just about, she would not be winning. She would probably lose.
I would probably
running. I would rather
still
vote for
be
you.
voting for her if she was the other option, just because the Republican Party has decided that it's okay to let this, when they decided that they were just going to take in the Tea Party and not really investigate what that was. I think that was the beginning of them. Not that I love Ronald Reagan. I did not like him at all. But I think that was the beginning of them becoming this, where they are now, which is this really, this kind of like two-headed hydra, which they have like the elite, and they have the small government side, and then they have this like rabid other side, and the one side that they had control of the other side, and they absolutely don't. So if I imagine if right now they're not focusing on that, they're focusing on Trump. So if Trump loses, they'll probably ignore that side again until the next election cycle, and then somebody crazier, perhaps, or someone a little bit more charismatic, like Ted Cruz, could come along, and I wouldn't want him to push any of the buttons either. So,
PJ, would you call Ted Cruz charismatic?
Well, you know, surprisingly, if you had Ted up here in a relatively small audience, he is more charming than you'd think. He is one of those people who is not telegenic, mercifully, because he's not somebody I support at all. But he has considerable more personal charm than you. So yeah, but what I think will happen is I do think Trump will lose, and I am not grabbing wood more than knocking wood over here, because I've been so wrong for so long, you know, about everything. I assumed that it was, you know, there was an initial circus to this election, and you know, when Trump got out of the tiny car, you know, I thought an elephant would step on him or something. I don't know, you know, I just assumed this would go away, and I kept assuming so, as so many people did. Anyway, the Republican, I think Hillary will be elected. I'll vote for her myself, as I said. But, and the Republican Party will be utterly destroyed, absolutely utterly destroyed, which is a good thing. They've got it coming. They have glommed on to nativist, indeed racist, xenophobic, and stupid. I mean, they've been out there advertising for those voters. They've been doing their best to attract those voters. They've also glommed on to a kind of cultural conservatism of which I simply do not approve. I do not think that it is anything, that the political system has anything to do with who marries who, or who does what with whom and when and where, or even things like who smokes what. You know, I just really feel that that's not part of the brief of the political system. So the Republican Party will be absolutely destroyed, and there is only one thing that will, I hope, put it back together on a more libertarian basis, on a sensible budgetary government size and scope sort of basis. And that, of course, will take a miracle, but we have one at hand, and that is Hillary Clinton. I have seen the Republican Party utterly and completely destroyed before. I'm not young. I was covering that Nixon and Watergate and Jerry Ford and his pardon of Nixon. I saw the Republican Party written off. There will never be another significant Republican victory in any way. 4 miraculous short years of Jimmy Carter later, we were back in play. You know, so I'm trusting that Hillary's 4 years will be as wonderful.
Bill, I mean, I think for me the difference this time is that there are things that have been said that can't be unsaid, but worse still, were not challenged. Does that change America?
Yeah, I wish I had the sort of cheerful view that PJ does. I think that Trump may win. We don't know what is in store in the next few months. ISIS could have a role in the election with a big October attack. There's a substantial correction, you know, in the voting booth in the case of like race-charged elections, where polls show the liberal or the black candidate ahead, and then boom, turns out there are a lot of white voters polled who say, you know, no, they're embarrassed to say they're voting for Trump in this case, say, and then this happened in some of the primaries. He surprised us. And that happened in a different context, obviously, but with the Brexit result in Britain, you know, a visceral anti-immigrant vote in many precincts, I think. People were embarrassed, and then they voted as they did. So there's that correction you have to account for as you look at the arithmetic of the election as it comes close. And there's also a tremendous, I mean, some of the things that, I'm not sure what you mean about things that have been said that can't be unsaid, besides the many gaffes and outrageous things Trump has said. But a lot of the sort of deep hatred of Obama has been recently increasingly transferred to Hillary. The anti-Hillary, I mean, the hatred is physical. It's really powerful. I mean, I don't see how you could get that worked up. I mean, she's a shining, leading member of an arguably corrupt elite. In some ways, more so than Trump. I mean, they come from the same world in a sense, but it's not that. I mean, it's deeply. It's, as I say, it feels physical to me. Some of what is coming out of the mob, as it were, at this point against her. So I have a. Even if she wins, that's, I think, liable to sort of deepen and accelerate, and not in a libertarian direction necessarily. I also fear the rise of a more clever demagogue than Trump, although he really is a sort of perfect storm. This reality, I mean, so familiar to tens of millions of people that we haven't met, and his particular kind of, I don't know what that is, his sentence structure doesn't parse. I mean, he never is able to complete a sentence in one direction.
Sad.
It's got to hook back to himself in some way and change directions, and he's that attention deficit's, you know, terrifying, and yet it appeals. And as the press, I mean, those of us working at this story at all, it's so frustrating. I mean, each time you think, now I've got some really, you know, big stuff to work with here, and Trump's really blown his foot off this time, and he keeps being this middle finger reaction. The worse he is, the more we like him. And at a certain point, we're not speaking the same language. Yeah. And I'm afraid that feeling is not going to go away, or not going to translate into gentle libertarianism if Hillary wins. So it's a darker view.
You know, I hope I'm right. I fear you may be. You know, I mean, but America has proved remarkably resilient. This is not the first ugly demagogue that has risen in American politics.
Indeed
not. Once we vomit them up, we do tend to feel better, you know, at least for a little while. Okay.
Well, that's as good a sunny moment to end on. And to quote one of my favourite movies, what we call flying high, what you guys call airplane, I just want to wish you all good luck. We're all counting on you. Would you please thank the panel? Jeffrey Renard Allen, Angela Flournoy, PJ O'Rourke, and Bill Finnegan. I'm Ben Knight. Thanks so much. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.